Something unsettling is happening in London right now, and what most people are missing is how quietly consequential it is becoming. Because this isn't just another celebrity flare-up or a passing culture war skirmish about social media etiquette. It's actually much more significant than that. And what we're watching is a collision between public advocacy, private conduct, and the credibility of institutions that claim to regulate power, visibility, and protection in the digital age. So stay with me because the stakes here stretch far beyond tabloid intrigue and into the architecture of modern accountability. And the scene is tense in ways you can almost feel, with phones lighting up across newsrooms, aides whispering in hallways, timelines refreshing in real time, and a kind of brittle silence settling over rooms where strategy is usually loud, because while Prince Harry is physically present in a London courtroom arguing that British media unlawfully intruded on his private life, his family's online presence is expanding in ways that raise questions. He has spent years warning the public about, and this isn't happening in a vacuum, because the posts appeared while he was overseas, because they circulated fast and algorithmically, and because they referenced domestic intimacy at the exact moment he was asking a judge to recognize the harm of exposure, which is where the story stops being about images and becomes about coherence. Because critics aren't merely nitpicking aesthetics or tone, they're pointing to a dissonance between message and method, between a public campaign built on protecting children from online harm and a digital strategy that seems comfortable flirting with visibility when it suits a narrative reset. And that's why this matters. Because credibility in modern public life isn't maintained by declarations, it's maintained by pattern. And the pattern people are noticing is this: when pressure mounts, when professional setbacks accumulate, and when family relationships strain under scrutiny, the response appears less about retreating from exposure and more about reasserting control over it. And what makes this unsettling is not that public figures curate their image, everyone does, but because the curation is occurring alongside legal arguments that depend on moral clarity. Short sentence: this is where privacy becomes leverage. And behind closed doors, according to people who track media strategy closely, there's an understanding that visibility can be a counteroffensive, that stage normalcy can soften harsher headlines, and that timing is rarely accidental. And here's what most people don't realize: institutions like courts, platforms, and public opinion don't adjudicate intent. They respond to consistency. And when consistency fractures, the benefit of the doubt evaporates. Because social media companies say their policies are strict and neutral, because they claim enforcement is blind to status, and because they insist context matters even when content is ambiguous, the absence of immediate action becomes its own message. And that message is being read by millions. And this isn't about whether the posts cross a technical line. It's about whether the line itself is visible anymore. And this is where the walls start to crack. Because when advocates appear to live by different rules than they demand, the argument stops persuading and starts provoking. And that's the real story emerging tonight. Not a scandal, but a stress test. Not a viral moment, but a revealing one. And as this debate accelerates online and in the press, the question forming beneath the noise is sharper than it looks. Who gets to define privacy in an economy that rewards exposure? And what happens when the people arguing the case embody the contradiction? And this is where the significance deepens, because once you move past the surface controversy and start laying the evidence side by side, a pattern emerges that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. And because Prince Harry's legal challenge in London is not abstract but specific, anchored in past tabloid practices, phone hacking scandals, and claims of systemic intrusion, the timing of the social media activity matters more than supporters want to admit, because courts, regulators, and the public all read behavior as context, and because critics are pointing to previous interviews where Harry explicitly warned that social media is dangerous for children, warned that platforms incentivize harm, and warned that parents must resist exposure even when attention feels benign, the contrast becomes sharper when posts appear that seem designed to invite precisely that attention. Short sentence. This isn't accidental optics. And while defenders argue the content shows nothing inappropriate and violates no written rule, what makes this revealing is that the debate isn't actually about rule breaking, it's about rule bending. Because modern influence rarely depends on crossing bright lines and instead lives in the gray zones where enforcement is discretionary, and behind closed doors, people familiar with crisis management will tell you that gray zones are where reputations are managed because plausible deniability can coexist with strategic intent. And here's what few realize. Social media platforms don't apply policy in a vacuum. They respond to scale, reaction velocity, and reputational risk, which means that silence from enforcement bodies is not neutral, it's a data point. And because no platform has publicly confirmed a review, critics see preferential ambiguity while supporters see proof of innocence, and that split itself fuels polarization. And this isn't the first time this pattern has appeared, because over the last several years we've seen a repeated cycle where public advocacy against media harm coincides with highly visible, carefully framed releases that reassert narrative control, and because psychologically, individuals who experience loss of status often oscillate between withdrawal and performance, between denunciation of systems and attempts to master them. This behavior tracks with what analysts recognize as threat response rather than hypocrisy. And that's important because understanding motivation doesn't excuse consequence. It explains trajectory. And while the public-facing message emphasizes victimhood and reform, privately, the machinery of modern public relations appears to be re-engaging, with reports of an assertive U.S.-based firm known for aggressive placement and rapid counter-narratives, suggesting not retreat but escalation. Short sentence. That's the tell. And institutionally, this matters because credibility is the currency that allows advocates to pressure platforms, legislators, and courts. And once that currency is questioned, leverage erodes fast. And when lawmakers and judges see arguments about protecting children delivered alongside behavior that tests those boundaries, the moral force of reform weakens, even if the legal claims remain technically sound. And this is where the pattern locks in, because while public statements frame scrutiny as proof of persecution, the structural reality is that influence amplifies scrutiny by design. And this isn't about personal failure. It's about a system that rewards visibility even when visibility contradicts stated values. But what makes this truly unsettling is what's happening at the next layer, where this contradiction begins to reshape how privacy itself is understood, not as a right to be defended consistently, but as a narrative position to be activated selectively, of victimhood and control, creating incentives that institutions have not caught up to regulating. And in any previous era, this tension would have been resolved through slower media cycles, clearer gatekeeping, and fewer feedback loops. But today, amplification outruns adjudication. And by the time rules respond, norms have already shifted. Short sentence, that shift sticks. And institutionally, when courts, platforms, and public opinion all hesitate to draw conclusions, the result isn't balance, it's drift. And drift favors those with resources, teams, and reach. And the cost of this will be borne not by celebrities, but by ordinary users whose content will be judged against standards quietly reshaped by exceptional cases. And that's why this matters, because normalization at the top recalibrates expectations at the bottom. And while supporters argue that scrutiny itself proves media obsession, critics point out that selective exposure invites selective outrage, and both sides miss the systemic consequence, a privacy framework that no longer rests on principle but on performance. And this is where the escalation becomes clear, because once privacy is treated as a strategic asset rather than a consistent value, institutions lose the ability to defend it credibly for anyone else. And the administration claims concern for child safety while simultaneously benefiting from ambiguity around enforcement. And that contradiction, left unresolved, teaches platforms that silence is safer than clarity. And what looked solid, rules, norms, shared expectations, now appears brittle under pressure, and this is not sustainable. And as this story continues to unfold, the question stops being whether this episode will fade and becomes whether it will quietly redefine the boundaries everyone else must live with. And this is where the story ultimately lands. Because when you step back far enough to see the whole frame, what we're witnessing is not a celebrity contradiction or a fleeting media dust-up, but a revealing moment in how modern democracies metabolize power, visibility, and accountability. And this moment matters because it exposes how advocacy can be hollowed out when it becomes contingent, how institutions falter when enforcement depends on discretion rather than principle, and how the public is left to arbitrate norms that once belonged to courts, regulators, and shared civic standards. And what makes this dangerous is not malice, but drift, because drift feels harmless while it quietly reorders expectations. Short sentence, drift changes rules, and history tells us that democracies rarely collapse through dramatic rupture. They erode through normalization, through repeated moments when inconsistencies are explained away as context and exceptions are justified as uniqueness. And because privacy in the digital age is already fragile, already negotiated against attention economies and algorithmic incentives, treating it as a narrative position rather than a stable right accelerates that erosion. And this isn't about Prince Harry or Meghan Markle as individuals. It's about what happens when influential actors argue for systemic reform while simultaneously navigating around its spirit. Because once that gap becomes visible, cynicism rushes in to fill it. And behind the scenes, institutional actors understand this dynamic well because they know legitimacy is not enforced. It's granted. And once granted selectively, it becomes impossible to universalize. And this is where the warning sharpens. Because when the public begins to believe that rules are elastic for some and rigid for others, compliance turns into performance and trust turns into transaction. Short sentence that corrodes everything. And the deeper problem is that awareness without accountability breeds fatigue, not reform. Because people stop asking whether systems can work and start asking whom they work for. And this is where the audience comes in, not as spectators of a controversy, but as participants in a choice point, because civic culture is shaped less by what institutions declare than by what the public accepts as normal. And once you see this pattern, you can unsee it, because you start recognizing how often visibility is framed as vulnerability and how often power hides behind claims of harm. And the question is no longer whether privacy deserves protection. It's who gets to define it, who gets to violate it with impunity, and who pays the cost. When definitions shift, and in every era where democratic norms have survived, survival depended on consistency, on the willingness to apply standards even when inconvenient, even when uncomfortable. And this is where the facade finally gives way, because without that consistency, advocacy becomes branding, enforcement becomes selective, and rights become conditional. Short sentence, conditional rights fail, and what we're watching now is not resolution, but exposure. A moment when contradictions are laid bare and the system reveals how it handles them, and whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point depends less on legal rulings than on public memory. And that's why attention matters, and that's why skepticism matters, and that's why refusing to normalize contradiction matters. And this is where the story leaves us, not with answers neatly tied off, but with a question history will recognize later. Did we notice when the line blurred? And did we decide it still mattered?